Every Christmas since cinema began, filmmakers have been trying to capitalise on the festive market. They do this by making movies that not only do well when released, but ones that last the ages. And while you get some very mediocre outings, I'm looking at you, 4 Christmases. Once in a while, perfection happens, and that's what Home Alone is. Christmas perfection. Now, this film is so packed with Easter eggs that even the most ardent fan can find amazing new details every year. And from rewatching this for the millionth time, that's what I've done. So sit back as we do a deep dive into one of the greatest festive outings ever made. But just before we get into it, we'd be grateful if you could give the video a like. And if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about all our weekly videos all about film and TV. We're closing in on 1,000 subscribers, so we'd love you to join our community. Anyway, I'm Stephen from Unmissable Movies. Let's get into it. Don't get scared now. So, before we even get into the opening, it's worth noting that we wouldn't have this film at all if it wasn't for Uncle Buck. See, the very concept for this movie originated during the filming of a scene in which Macaulay Culkin plays a character who interrogates a would-be sitter through the letter opening in the front door. Right, the film opens with John Williams' incredible score and the melody of the song Somewhere in My Memories. John Williams wasn't actually due to score this film, but stepped in when the original composer backed out. The filmmakers never thought they'd get the veteran maestro, but he saw an early cut of the movie and was enchanted. Thank goodness, because this film wouldn't be half of what it is without his work. After the title card, we get a first look at the Mcallister Household. This is a real house in Chicago and was even on the market within the last decade. It sold for $1.5 million, which is only $13.5 million less than the film's original budget. One day I'd love to watch this film in that house. If you're in that house, let me know. In the opening sequence, we're introduced to all of Kevin's family: Peter, Kate, Buzz, Megan, Linny and Jeff. Interestingly, to this day, Macaulay Culkin calls Catherine O'Hara Mum.
I haven't seen him for years and years, but I saw him 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago at a Martin Mull art opening. And he was coming out and he went, "Mommy," and I said, "Baby."
We also get a first look at Joe Pesci playing Harry, but here he's in disguise as a police officer surveying the neighbourhood. I love this moment when Jeff throws his bag down the stairs, foreshadowing Harry's fate later in the movie by the hands of another Mcallister. Interestingly, Joe Pesci avoided Macaulay Culkin on the set to deliberately unnerve him to create another dimension to their scenes. This early bit of the movie has a really great subtle filmmaking technique by the director too. Kevin is shot from above, making him seem smaller and more childlike. Then this shifts to Kevin being filmed at eye level as his confidence grows throughout the movie. Joining the already large family is Frank, Leslie and a shed load of cousins who are all staying with Peter and Kate before a trip to France. Now, the first fan theory we'll share here is that Peter Mcallister is actually a mid-level mobster. It is Chicago. We don't know what he does for a living, but he can afford to take his entire family away to France. When he sees Harry dressed as a Chicago police officer to warn the family about crime in the area, he gets very defensive and asks, "Am I in some kind of trouble, officer?" Then, despite having a police officer in his house, he just wanders off with Buzz. Buzz could even be primed to get his dad out of this situation. You've also later got the Wet Bandits talking specifically about that house being the prize, and it's unclear why. There's nothing particularly different about it compared to the other houses on the street. That is, unless Harry and Marv have been tipped off about something of greater value in that house. It's pretty suspicious. During the chaos, Little Nero's Pizza arrives. This is an obvious play on Little Caesars, and the running gag of the statue outside the home being knocked over begins. While the whole family are wolfing down that pizza, we get a first glimpse of Kevin's cousin Fuller, played by Macaulay Culkin's real-life brother, Kieran, who's still a really prevalent actor. The only plain cheese pizza gets demolished by Buzz before Kevin gets any, which is an injustice that Kevin rights later in the movie. In this moment, however, in response, he attacks Buzz and brings about an almighty commotion that includes plane tickets getting damaged. One amazing detail here is the insert close-up included by the director that shows Kevin plane tickets being thrown into the bin. Or trash. One of the big challenges with the whole concept was the feeling that no parent would actually forget their child, and this element just helps the case that he could be forgotten. Another element in this opening sequence that we haven't touched on is the character Old Man Marley. He spends his evenings salting the pavement, or sidewalk. This is to make sure people don't slip. Now, even though the kids in the movie have their own theories around this character, namely that he keeps the bodies of people he's killed buried in the salt, there are no shortage of online theories around his significance. One theory is that his wife died slipping on the ice, and it was one of his son's chores to salt that ice, which he failed to do, which is why Marley and his son are estranged. An even more out there theory is that Marley is actually Kevin from the future. It sounds wild, but it does have some merits. Think about it. It's Old Man Marley who has the vital heart-to-heart with Kevin before he saves his house. It's Marley who stops Kevin being murdered by the Wet Bandits in the end, which enables him to reconcile with his family, something Marley isn't able to do until he's much older and wiser in years. Plus, Marley has this strange wound that heals, not with time, but as he nears reconciliation with his family. His gushing wound from the drugstore is remedied with a simple band-aid within a day or two, and then a day later it's completely healed at the same time as he embraces his once estranged family. It's pretty outlandish, but it's gained increasing following. A really sweet fact about Robert Blossom, who played Marley, is that he considered Home Alone to be one of his high points of his career. He said kids would often recognise him from playing Old Man Marley. Anyway, back to the main narrative. The entire family oversleeps somehow and we get our second knocked over statue gag, followed by the scramble to get ready. For this sequence, John Williams borrowed heavily from Tchaikovsky, which is why you might have always found it familiar. This is the Nutcracker Theme, and this is the theme from the film. It's still genius though, as Williams' version does seem to have a slightly festive edge, although that might just be in my head. Outside, the stupid neighbour kid confuses the head count, which is another detail trying to legitimise the narrative of Kevin's parents leaving him behind. The kid, played by Jeffrey Wiseman, actually auditioned for the role of Kevin, but although he and hundreds of others were looked at, none came near to the stage presence they knew Macaulay Culkin had. As the family board the plane, there's a load of little cameos that you'd never notice. The woman in the red sweater is Christopher Columbus's mother-in-law. The baby is his daughter, and the flight attendant is his wife, Monica. Back in the house, Kevin starts enjoying all the freedoms of an empty home. In the process of exploring, he stumbles on Buzz's stuff and finds a picture of his girlfriend. The director didn't want to upset an actual girl for this joke, so his son dressed up as the girl for this scene. Kevin also comes across a Playboy magazine, but the pages were taped together so that the young Macaulay Culkin wouldn't see any nudity. Kevin also takes liberties by watching Angels with Filthy Souls, a movie far too graphic for him. This of course isn't an actual film, but something that was captured specifically for Home Alone, though it is a play on the real film Angels with Dirty Faces. For this faux movie, the role of Gangster Johnny was played by actor Ralph Foodie, while Snakes was played by Michael Guido. According to Vanity Fair, the roles were originally reversed, but Foodie had recently had a knee replacement surgery and couldn't physically perform Snake's dramatic death. Guido told Vanity Fair, "That was perfectly fine with me since both the roles were fun. But a few years later I realised that I was just about the only actor from the original film who wasn't invited to be in the sequel because my character was dead." That's unlucky. Another one of Kevin's antics is to sledge from the top of his stairs out through the front door. This is one of those moments where every viewer points out the implausibility of this feat. This scene, and indeed all of Kevin's more dangerous stunts, were performed by 30-year-old Larry Nicholas, who was just short enough to be convincing as a double for an 8-year-old boy. Next we see the Wet Bandits with Daniel Stern joining Joe Pesci as one of the film's main villains. Stern very nearly wasn't in the movie as the producers wanted him for 2 weeks longer than the initial agreed 6 weeks, but they wouldn't pay him any more. Stern actually pulled out and they instead cast Daniel Roebuck, but after a few days it was clear his chemistry with Pesci wasn't strong enough, so they forked up the increased wages. The family arrive in Paris, and if you look just beyond the doors here, you see there's actually a welcome greeting from Uncle Bob. This was going to be a scene where they burst through the sign and straight to the phones to call Kevin, but they got cut. When Kate gets through to the police, she talks to Officer Balzac, played by Larry Hankin, who you might recognise as Mr. Heckles in Friends. I'd love to know if this donut falling on the phone receiver was intentional. I'm guessing not. The police go and check on Kevin, and the officer here is actually Christopher Columbus's father-in-law, who you can see was also knocked over the statue. Interestingly, the film was going to have loads more scenes with the family in Paris, but test audiences just wanted to get back to Kevin, so they cut them. Kevin goes about his business and goes shopping for a toothbrush, and on his way back, he has a run-in with the Wet Bandits. This shot was actually filmed in reverse to avoid any unhappy accidents. They arrive at the Mcallister house later that evening, and Kevin manages to convince the would-be robbers that a Christmas party is taking place. The scene was just going to be Kevin playing piano, but they realised the lavish setup would be much more fun. We also see a cutout of Michael Jordan that was visible in an earlier scene in the movie. As Kate continues to make her way home, we see her queuing in Scranton Airport. A few major conspiracy theories come about in this one shot. The first is the long-believed detail that the person behind Kate is none other than the king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley himself. There is a slight resemblance, but we know for certain it isn't him. One, because Elvis was dead at the time this film was made. The other is that we know the actor's name, and it's someone called Gary Grott. The other theory here is a dark one, and it suggests that Gus Polinski is actually the devil. Kate says, "If I have to sell my soul to the devil himself," and then Gus swoops right in. In literature, whenever people make a deal with the devil, they never quite get what they bargained for. And this fits, as Kate only gets home minutes before the rest of the family anyway. Amazingly, John Candy's entire role in this film was actually shot in just one day. Granted, it was an extremely long 23-hour day. It's also reported that he ad-libbed 90% of his lines. Back in the house, Kevin gets spooked when he sees Harry's reflection in a bauble. They managed to get this shot with a hidden camera. That's not so hidden once it's pointed out to you. We then have a few more scenes with Kevin out and about. The first shows Kevin arriving late to a Santa's grotto. The woman playing the elf here is also the flight attendant from Home Alone 2. And the guy playing Santa really did stall pulling out the end of the scene. I can't believe this wasn't intended, as it's one of the funniest gags in the film. Later, Kevin stops into a church. This church is actually very close to the real house in Chicago. The arrangement for Carol of the Bells in this scene is also done by John Williams, and the blend of this into the music entitled Setting a Trap is breathtaking. Kevin now begins to ready his house for Harry and Marv. Now, it's a pretty well-known theory that Kevin's theatrics in setting house traps has caused some people to think he's actually Jigsaw, the killer from the Saw movies. I think it's bogus, but Macaulay Culkin did poke fun at this in a web series a few years ago.
I defend off my house from 2 psychopath home invaders.
Macaulay Culkin was also the artist behind the poster filled with traps for the house. I can't tell you how many times I did this in my own house as a child. Now, there are so many great details to work through in this final showdown between Kevin and the Wet Bandits. First, Marv pokes his head through a dog flap. Kevin fires his BB gun at him from close range, and this effect was actually achieved by a low-budget local artist working from home in Chicago. He had to add the BB frame by frame, and the result is pretty great. Harry burns his hand on the front door of the house. This is actually a nod to what happens to the main antagonist in Raiders of the Lost Ark. Harry's iconic "Fratcha" came because the director was trying to steer Pesci away from actual swearing, which he kept doing. Goodfellas was the same year, so maybe that's why. Some of Marv's foot-related injuries were achieved using really simple methods. The nail sinking into his foot was actually done with a rubber foot, even though it's really hard to watch. And the Christmas ornaments he stands on were made of candy glass, which is so painless Stern could do this with his real feet. Kevin runs up the stairs and says the famous line, "You guys give up or you're thirsty for more." And this was actually improvised by Macaulay Culkin. Another few lines of improvisation in this act of the movie came from Daniel Stern, as both Marv's lines, "Why the hell you dressed like a chicken," and "Maybe he committed suicide," weren't in the script. When you think of it, it's pretty amazing that second line stayed in. Another great trick asked of Stern was when the Wet Bandits catch up with Kevin and the young trickster puts a spider on Marv's face. The scream had to be recorded in post as to not scare the spider, and Stern just made the face. It's so well put together though. When Kevin escapes, we again see his stunt double, though here it's a little more noticeable than elsewhere in the movie. The Wet Bandits catch up with Kevin, and apparently, Joe Pesci accidentally bit Macaulay Culkin's finger here, giving him a permanent scar. It sounds painful, but it's a pretty cool memento from the film. Once things wrap up, the family return, and the movie was going to end with a freeze frame when Peter asks Kevin what he was doing while they were away. Kevin responds, "Just hanging around," and that was it. It was just going to freeze frame at that moment. But thank goodness Christopher Columbus and John Hughes both felt that the Marley story arc wasn't concluded. They decided to reshoot the ending in which Kevin witnesses old man Marley reconciling with his son, and that he took Kevin's advice. Little shifts like this really do make this film such a classic. Rather than going for the easy option, every single element was fine-tuned. A slightly sickening final fact that we have for you is that Warner Brothers were unhappy that the budget for this film climbed from 14 to 17 million, so they released it and Fox picked it up. It went on to gross over 500 million. And that concludes our breakdown of this festive classic. Are there any details we missed? If so, get involved in the comments section below. We're going to be doing Home Alone 2 next week, so do subscribe and ring the bell and we'll notify you in the next week. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you soon.